Augusto Beneventi had built an empire by giving orders no one dared refuse. But 3 weeks after his father's suspicious death, the feared Mafia boss found himself facing a problem that money, power, and violence couldn't solve. He needed a wife, immediately. And when the quiet housekeeper, who had spent 2 years making herself invisible inside his mansion, walked into his study, Augusto made a decision that stunned even his closest men. "I need a wife now. Come with me." Peggy Williams slowly looked up at him. What she did next was so unexpected that for once, Augusto Beneventi had absolutely no response. Before we find out what Peggy did, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far Augusto and Peggy's story travels. Also, if your terrifying boss suddenly ordered you to marry him, what's your answer? Comment yes or no. Because Peggy's answer wasn't what anyone in that room expected. And before this was over, Augusto would risk his entire empire for the woman he'd once thought he could simply command. Peggy had learned that the safest way to survive in a house owned by dangerous men was to make yourself forgettable. For 2 years, it had worked perfectly, until Augusto Beneventi looked at her like she'd just solved a problem he hadn't spoken aloud. She stopped in the doorway of his study, coffee tray balanced in her hands, and met his gaze directly. No, his consigliere, Luca Ferrante, glanced up from the documents spread across the desk. Augusto's expression didn't change. "I haven't said anything. You're looking at me like you've solved a problem," Peggy said. "I don't like being looked at that way." She set the espresso down with the same careful precision she'd used every evening for 2 years. Augusto drank coffee after dinner. Always. She'd learned his preferences the way she'd learned everything about this house, through quiet attention. "I need a wife. Now, come with me." Peggy's hands stilled. She looked at him and saw what most people missed beneath the cold authority: exhaustion. His father had died 3 weeks ago, and Augusto hadn't slept properly since. "No," she said again. Luca made a sound that might have been suppressed laughter. "You understand what I'm offering," Augusto said. "I understand what you're ordering." The answer is no. She should leave, but her feet didn't move, because she'd learned to recognize when a powerful man was genuinely surprised. "Why?" Augusto asked. "Because I know what Mafia marriages cost, and I'm not interested in paying." "She's right to refuse," Augusto said quietly, though his attention never left Peggy. "My father left a succession provision. To formalize leadership, I need to demonstrate stability, including a legally recognized household. There's a council vote in 10 days. Peggy knew about the vote. Everyone in the house did. "You have options," she said carefully. "I had an option, until my security chief discovered she'd been communicating with my uncle Cesare." The name landed like a stone. Cesare Beneventi had attended Vittorio's funeral with grief so perfectly calibrated it had made Peggy's skin crawl. "So you need someone outside the usual circles," Peggy said slowly. "Someone your enemies couldn't have planted. Someone already vetted. Someone discreet. Someone who understands how this household operates." Augusto paused. 3 months. Then an amicable separation, properly compensated. Peggy thought about her sister, about the debt that followed their father's death, about years spent working to keep that shadow from touching anyone else. "No," she said, and turned toward the door. She made it 3 steps before Luca's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then at Augusto. "The preliminary report on your father's medical records just arrived. Inconsistencies. Symptoms that don't align with the official cause of death, and there's a gap in the security footage." Peggy stopped. Augusto took the phone and went absolutely still. "Someone murdered my father." "It appears so," Luca said. "And whoever arranged it is likely still inside your organization." Augusto's gaze shifted to Peggy. "You should go. Forget what you heard. It wasn't a threat. It was permission." Peggy looked at the door, at freedom, at the safe, invisible life she'd built by never getting involved. Then she thought about Cesare's calculated grief, about the fact that if Augusto lost the council vote, his uncle would take control, and the Morettis, who held her father's debt, had warmer relationships with Cesare than with Augusto. She turned back. "I have conditions," Peggy said. Augusto's expression shifted into something that might have been respect. "You haven't agreed," he pointed out. "No," Peggy said. "I'm explaining what agreement would look like." The contract negotiation lasted until midnight. Peggy sat across from Augusto in his study and laid out her terms with the same methodical precision she'd once used to organize his household. 3 months, not 6. Separate bedroom. No expectation of intimacy. No criminal participation. Freedom of movement, with reasonable security. Her sister remained completely outside Beneventi business. And the Moretti debt, the weight that had crushed her family and driven her into this house 2 years ago, would be settled immediately, with documentation proving it extinguished regardless of what happened between them. The final clause was hers alone. "You don't make decisions about my life without me." Augusto read it twice, then signed without argument. The civil ceremony took place the next afternoon, in a municipal building that smelled of lemon cleaner and old paper. Peggy signed her name on documents that would tie her legally to Augusto Beneventi for the next 3 months, and her hand shook just enough that the final letter blurred. Augusto noticed. He noticed everything. But he didn't comment, and Peggy was grateful for that small mercy. In the hallway afterward, while a clerk processed paperwork, Augusto turned to her. "The council expects to meet you at dinner tonight. Family only. My Aunt Julia, my cousin Marco, and unfortunately, Cesare. He'll know about the marriage within the hour." That's the point. Peggy understood. The marriage wasn't just about satisfying succession requirements. It was a move designed to destabilize whoever had been counting on Augusto remaining politically vulnerable. The clerk returned with final documents. Augusto accepted them, then looked at Peggy. "May I?" She looked at his offered hand, understanding what he was asking. Permission to touch her, to begin the performance that would convince his family this marriage was real enough to matter. Peggy took his hand. His grip was warm and steady. For a moment they stood there in the sterile hallway, and Peggy felt the full weight of what she'd agreed to settle over her. Then Augusto said, very quietly, "Thank you." She hadn't expected that. The Beneventi estate looked different when Peggy walked through the front entrance instead of the service door. The marble floors she'd cleaned gleamed under chandeliers she'd dusted, and the portraits she'd straightened watched her passage with expressions ranging from stern to disapproving. Augusto's hand remained at the small of her back, proper, formal, entirely for the benefit of household staff who had suddenly stopped pretending not to stare. "Your room is in the east wing," Augusto said as they climbed the main staircase, "adjacent to mine, with a connecting door that locks from your side." True to the contract, he showed her to a suite decorated in soft grays and cream, with tall windows overlooking gardens she used to see only from the kitchen. "If you need anything changed, it's fine," Peggy said. "More than fine." Beautiful in a way that made her chest tight. Augusto moved toward the connecting door, then paused. "We should discuss what the family will expect to see. Physical familiarity. Nothing inappropriate, but couples who've been married long enough to satisfy the council don't maintain formal distance. So you'll need to touch me. Only with permission." Peggy studied him. This man who commanded obedience from everyone, but stood in her doorway, waiting for consent. "At your waist during introductions," she said. "My hand when we're seated. Nothing that looks staged." "Agreed. And if you need me to stop, then I stop." The simplicity was oddly reassuring. "One more thing," Augusto said. "You'll need to know details about me. Enough to answer questions convincingly. Your favorite food is whatever someone else cooks because you don't have one," Peggy said. "You drink espresso after dinner, take meetings in the East Study because the light's better, and you hate flowers in workspaces. You read financial reports before security briefings, and you haven't slept properly since your father died. Augusto stared at her. I've worked here for 2 years, Peggy said quietly. I pay attention. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition that the invisible woman he'd barely noticed had been seeing him more clearly than he'd realized. And you? He asked. What should I know? Peggy hadn't expected the question to be reciprocal. She thought about deflecting, maintaining the careful distance she'd kept since accepting employment here. Then she remembered the contract clause. No decisions about my life without me. If this was going to work, she couldn't remain invisible. Not to him. I send money to my sister every month, Peggy said. I studied architecture before my father died. I sketch buildings I'll probably never design. And I don't believe in love, but I believe in keeping promises. Augusto absorbed this with focused attention. Then we understand each other, he said finally. Peggy wasn't sure they did, but she nodded anyway, and watched him leave through the connecting door that locked, as promised, from her side alone. Dinner was served in the formal dining room at 8. Peggy wore a dress that Augusto's assistant had procured. Simple, elegant, expensive in a way that made her uncomfortable. When she emerged, Augusto was waiting. His gaze traveled over her once. You look appropriate. Peggy wore a dress that Augusto's assistant had procured. Simple, elegant, expensive in a way that made her uncomfortable. You look appropriate. Peggy almost smiled. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. I'm not trying to be romantic. I know. Something that might have been humor flickered across his face. Then he offered his arm, and together they walked downstairs to convince his family that the maid he'd barely noticed had somehow become the woman he'd married. Cesare Beneventi rose from his seat the moment they entered the dining room, his expression arranged into something that might have passed for warmth if Peggy hadn't seen the calculation beneath it. Augusto, he said, I received your news with such surprise. You've kept this relationship remarkably private. I value discretion, Augusto replied smoothly, his hand settling at Peggy's waist exactly as they'd discussed. Uncle, you remember Peggy? Cesare's gaze moved over her, and Peggy saw the precise moment he placed her. The maid, the invisible woman who'd served him coffee 100 times without once meriting his attention. Of course, he said, his smile tightening. How unexpected. Aunt Julia, 73 and sharp as broken glass, saved Peggy from responding. Unexpected or not, she's family now. Sit down, child, before the pasta gets cold. Peggy found herself guided to a seat beside Augusto, across from Marco, Cesare's son, who watched with the wary expression of someone trying to determine which direction danger would come from. The first course arrived. Peggy had served meals in this room often enough to know the rhythm, the careful dance of conversation that revealed nothing and implied everything. But sitting at the table instead of standing behind it transformed the entire experience. So, Julia said, fixing Peggy with a look that could have stripped paint. How did this happen? Peggy had prepared for this question. We've known each other for 2 years. The relationship developed quietly. Quietly, Cesare repeated. How convenient, given the succession timeline. Augusto's expression didn't change, but Peggy felt his stillness. The timeline is irrelevant. The marriage is legal. Legal, certainly. Cesare reached for his wine, though the council may have questions about its authenticity. Then the council is welcome to ask them. The temperature dropped several degrees. Marco studied his plate with sudden fascination. Julia, however, looked delighted. I like her already, she announced. Any woman brave enough to marry into this family deserves respect, timing be damned. Peggy met the older woman's gaze and saw not suspicion, but understanding. Tell me, Peggy, Julia continued, what do you make of the library? Augusto's mother redesigned it before she passed. The question seemed innocuous, but Peggy recognized the test beneath it. Anyone could claim to know Augusto. Only someone who'd actually lived in this house would know its details. The east-facing windows, Peggy said. The morning light makes it the best room for reading before the house gets busy. And the shelving is organized by subject rather than author, which suggests someone who used books for research rather than decoration. Julia's smile sharpened. You pay attention. It's a useful skill. Across the table, Cesare's expression had gone carefully neutral. Peggy understood what he'd been trying to do, expose her as an opportunist, a convenient solution to Augusto's succession problem. But her knowledge of the house made that accusation harder to sustain. The conversation shifted to business matters. Peggy listened more than she spoke, but when Marco mentioned a property acquisition in the South District, she couldn't stop herself. The building with the foundation issues? Marco blinked. How did you know about that? I overheard the engineering report last month. The ground floor needs significant work before it's safe for occupancy. Silence fell over the table. You remember that? Augusto asked quietly. Peggy realized she'd made a mistake. Maids weren't supposed to retain information about business dealings. But she was no longer the maid. I remember most things, she said carefully. Augusto's hand found hers beneath the table. The touch was brief, gentle, reassurance rather than performance. Then perhaps you should attend the property meetings, he said. Your observations might prove valuable. Cesare's wineglass paused halfway to his mouth. Peggy understood what Augusto had just done. He'd transformed her accidental knowledge into an asset, giving her a reason to exist in his world, beyond being decorative. Julia laughed, sharp and approving. Oh, she's definitely staying. I haven't seen anyone surprise you in years, Augusto. The rest of dinner passed with careful civility, but Peggy felt the shift. She'd entered as the maid who'd inexplicably married the boss. She left as someone who might actually belong. Later, after they'd retreated upstairs and the performance was over, Augusto paused outside her door. You did well tonight. Your uncle hates me. My uncle hates everyone. But he's uncertain now, which is better than confident. Augusto's gaze held hers. The council will ask questions. Let them ask. You know this house better than most of the family does. That's not something we invented. It was true, and somehow that made everything more complicated. Good night, Augusto, Peggy said quietly. He inclined his head and turned toward his own room. But before he disappeared through the connecting door, he glanced back. Peggy? Yes? Thank you. For the foundation warning, Marco would have walked into that acquisition blindly. Then he was gone, and Peggy stood in the hallway, wondering when exactly the performance had started feeling real. The nightmare pulled Augusto awake at 3 a.m. He didn't cry out. He'd learned that discipline years ago, but his heart hammered against his ribs. The dream was always the same, his father's study, the smell of expensive cognac, Vittorio's voice explaining why love was a liability intelligent men couldn't afford. Augusto pushed himself upright and reached for the water on his nightstand. His hand shook slightly. He waited until it steadied before drinking. He should try to sleep again. He had meetings in the morning, calls with associates who would interpret any sign of weakness as opportunity. Instead, he headed downstairs toward the kitchen. He found Peggy already there. She sat at the small table near the window, with a sketchpad open in front of her and a mug of tea cooling beside her elbow. She'd changed into worn cotton pajamas, and her hair was pulled back in a careless knot. She looked up when he entered, unsurprised. Can't sleep? She asked. I could say the same. I'm used to being awake at odd hours. She gestured toward the espresso machine. Help yourself. Augusto made coffee, aware of her watching with quiet attention. When he turned back, she'd shifted to make room at the table. He sat. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence reminded Augusto of late evenings, when he'd worked in his study, and Peggy had moved through the house completing her tasks, both existing in the same space without requiring anything from each other. Don't, he said finally. Peggy's gaze lifted from her sketch. Don't what? Ask if I'm all right. I wasn't going to. Something in Augusto's chest loosened. Everyone else had spent 3 weeks asking how he was managing, offering condolences he didn't want, and concern that felt like surveillance. Peggy simply drank her tea and returned to her drawing. After a while, Augusto leaned forward to see what she was working on. The sketch showed a modest residential building with wide windows and a central courtyard. "What is it?" he asked. "A women's shelter." Her pencil moved across the page. "I've been designing it for months. Probably nothing will come of it, but," she shrugged. Augusto studied the drawing more carefully. The design was thoughtful, creating private spaces while maintaining sightlines for security. Every room had natural light. "You're good," he said. Peggy glanced at him, surprised. "It's just something I do when I can't sleep." "No, the design is genuinely good. You studied architecture?" "Almost 3 years, before my father died." Her expression didn't change, but Augusto heard the weight beneath the words. The debt made finishing impossible. The Moretti debt. "Yes, which you cleared, according to our contract. The paperwork came through yesterday." She set down her pencil. "I called my sister. Told her she didn't need to worry anymore." She cried. I haven't heard her sound that relieved in years. Something about the way she said it made Augusto realize how much weight Peggy had been carrying. Not just the debt, but the responsibility of protecting someone she loved from consequences she hadn't created. He stood to make her fresh tea. She took it with honey, no milk, and brought it back to the table. "You're terrible company, you know," Peggy said as she accepted the mug. "You're in my kitchen. That doesn't improve your conversation." Augusto felt the corner of his mouth twitch. When was the last time someone had spoken to him this way? Without calculation, without fear, without wanting something he hadn't offered. He reached for her sketch pad. "May I?" Peggy nodded, and he paged through carefully. More than a dozen buildings, each designed to create spaces where people could feel safe. Libraries with reading nooks positioned away from entrances. Community centers with multiple exits. Apartment buildings where every unit had light and air. "These are all about protection," he observed. "Is that surprising? I've spent 2 years working for you." The comment was simply factual. "My world isn't known for making people feel safe," Augusto said quietly. "No." Peggy met his gaze. "But these buildings aren't for your world. They're for people trying to survive outside it." He handed the sketchpad back, struck by the realization that while he'd spent his life learning to control spaces through power and surveillance, Peggy had been imagining how to design spaces that gave power back to the people using them. They sat together until the sky began to lighten. Peggy returned to her sketches. Augusto answered emails. At some point, the quiet stopped feeling like interrupted sleep and started feeling like its own kind of rest. When dawn broke, Peggy closed her sketchpad and stood. "I should let you prepare for your meetings." Augusto rose as well. "Peggy." She paused. "Thank you for not asking." She understood. "You're welcome. For what it's worth, you're slightly better company at 3 in the morning." "Only slightly?" "I'm being generous." After she left, Augusto remained in the kitchen, looking at the chair where she'd been sitting, the mug she'd left in the sink, the small space they'd shared without performance or pretense. He'd married Peggy Williams because he'd needed someone outside the conspiracy. Somewhere between the contract and this quiet morning, convenient had stopped being the right word. The charity gala was exactly the kind of event Augusto despised. Elaborate performance masquerading as philanthropy. But it was also the first major public appearance since the marriage, which meant attendance wasn't optional. Peggy emerged from her room wearing a dress the color of midnight, simple and elegant, in a way that made every other woman's gown look like it was trying too hard. "Will this work?" she asked, uncertainty flickering across her face. "Yes," Augusto said, and meant it. The gala unfolded exactly as he'd anticipated. Tedious speeches, careful networking, constant awareness of being watched and assessed. But having Peggy beside him transformed the experience. She navigated conversations with quiet competence, deflecting intrusive questions and offering observations that made him see familiar situations differently. At one point, he noticed her watching couples on the dance floor. "You don't dance?" she asked quietly. "I know how." That wasn't the question. She was right. When was the last time you danced? College. A friend's wedding. Before everything fell apart. Her gaze remained on the couples swaying to sophisticated music. "It seems like something that belongs to a different life." Augusto made a decision. "Come with me." He offered his hand. "Here?" Peggy looked startled. "May I?" She understood what he was asking. Not just permission to dance, but permission to cross another line between performance and something real. After a moment, she placed her hand in his. The dance floor was crowded enough that their presence didn't draw immediate attention. Augusto's hand settled at Peggy's waist, the same formal position they'd used at family dinners, but this time the contact felt different, less like strategy and more like choice. They moved together with surprising ease, finding a rhythm that didn't require thought or negotiation. "Is this still for the council?" Peggy asked quietly. Augusto looked down at her, at the woman who'd spent 2 years invisible in his house, and 1 week surprising him at every turn. "No," he said. Her breath caught, barely perceptible, but he felt it. The song ended. They remained on the dance floor for a heartbeat longer than necessary before stepping apart. 3 days later, Augusto discovered Peggy's sketches again while looking for a document in the library. The folder had fallen behind a chair. Architectural drawings, more detailed than the ones she'd shown him in the kitchen. He studied them carefully, recognizing genuine talent in the way she'd designed spaces that balanced security with openness. Then he made 3 phone calls. The first was to the dean of the city's most prestigious architecture program, a man whose department received substantial funding from Beneventi charitable foundations. The second was to his attorney, arranging for Peggy's previous academic credits to be reviewed and her application fast-tracked. The third was to his assistant, instructing her to prepare the necessary documentation. By the time Peggy returned from visiting her sister that afternoon, Augusto had opened the door he thought she'd been unable to reach. He found her in the library and handed her the folder. "What's this?" she asked. "Your application to the architecture program. They've agreed to review your previous credits. If everything processes as expected, you could start next semester." Peggy went very still. She opened the folder slowly, reading through documents that represented 3 years of lost dreams suddenly restored. Then she closed it and looked at him. "You did this without asking me." Augusto heard something in her tone that made him hesitate. You thought you were helping." Peggy's voice was quiet, controlled. "You thought you were fixing a problem." "Peggy." "No." She set the folder down with careful precision. "We had one rule, Augusto. One. You don't make decisions about my life without me. This isn't a decision, it's an opportunity. That you arranged, using your money, your connections, your power." Her gaze held his, and he saw something in her expression that looked like disappointment. "Do you understand what you've done? If I get accepted now, I'll never know if it was because of my work or because Augusto Beneventi made a phone call." The words landed like a physical blow. "That wasn't my intention," Augusto said. "I know. That's what makes it worse." Peggy's hands were shaking slightly. "You saw something I wanted, and decided the fastest way to give it to me was to control the outcome, just like you control everything else. I was trying to help." "No, you were trying to fix. There's a difference." She picked up the folder and held it out to him. "I don't want this. Not like this." Augusto didn't take it. "Peggy, you don't protect people." "Augusto." Her voice cracked slightly. "You control the direction they run in. And I can't." She stopped, composing herself. "I spent years trapped by my father's choices. I won't trade that cage for a prettier one, even if you call it protection." She left the folder on the table and walked out. Augusto stood alone in the library, surrounded by his mother's carefully organized books, and understood that he'd just damaged something he hadn't realized he'd started to care about protecting. Peggy didn't come down for dinner. Augusto ate alone in his study, the folder still sitting where she'd left it, and tried to understand where exactly he'd gone wrong. He'd seen a problem. He'd solved it. That was what he did. Identify obstacles and eliminate them through superior resources and strategic planning. Except Peggy wasn't a problem to be solved, and her dream wasn't an obstacle to be eliminated. It was hers. The realization settled over him slowly, uncomfortable and undeniable. For the first time in years, Augusto Beneventi had tried to help someone and made everything worse. Late that night, he heard Peggy moving around in her room through the connecting door. He almost knocked, almost tried to explain, but the contract had been clear. You don't make decisions about my life without me. And he had. 2 days passed in careful silence. Peggy attended family dinners and performed her role as Augusto's wife with the same competence she brought to everything. But the ease they'd found in his kitchen at 3 in the morning had vanished. She was polite, appropriate, and completely unreachable. Augusto hated it. He'd tried apologizing. Peggy had accepted with the kind of gracious distance that made clear the apology changed nothing. She wasn't angry. Anger would have been easier to navigate. She was disappointed, and that was infinitely worse. The council vote was in 4 days. Augusto should have been focused entirely on securing his position, but instead, he found himself distracted by the woman who slept in the room adjacent to his and felt further away than she had when she'd been invisible. The break in their stalemate came from an unexpected direction. Peggy found Augusto in his study late on the 3rd evening, reviewing security reports with Luca. She hesitated in the doorway, and Augusto saw the moment she almost turned away. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. Luca glanced at Augusto, who nodded. The consigliere gathered his documents and left, closing the door behind him. Peggy remained standing near the entrance, maintaining careful distance. "I've been thinking about the night your father died," she said. "About what I saw." Augusto went very still. "What did you see?" "I was finishing the upper hallway around 11, your father's private study, the small one he used when he didn't want to be disturbed. The door was open slightly. I saw Luca inside." "Luca was in the city that night," Augusto said automatically. "He arrived the next morning." "I know. That's what he told everyone." Peggy's expression was troubled. "But I saw him, Augusto. He was standing near your father's desk, and he looked—" She stopped, searching for the right word. "Agitated. I didn't think anything of it at the time. He's your consigliere. He's supposed to be in your father's study. But, the next morning, I found a wine stain on his cuff while collecting laundry. Dark red, expensive vintage. The kind your father kept in that study." She met his gaze. Luca claimed he'd just arrived from another city. Why would his shirt have wine from a room he wasn't supposed to be in? Augusto's mind raced through implications. Luca had been with him for 8 years. Loyal, competent, almost brotherly. The idea that he could have been involved in Vittorio's death felt impossible. Except Peggy's observation explained something that had been nagging at him. The security footage gap had occurred in a specific window, one that someone with intimate knowledge of the system's maintenance schedule would have known about. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Because yesterday I was in your office organizing files, and I saw the embossed folder Luca was carrying. The one with the Beneventi crest stamped in the corner." Peggy's voice remained steady. "I've dusted his office enough times to recognize his personal stationery. It's distinctive, imported paper, specific embossing. He orders it from a shop in Milano." Augusto remembered the folder. Luca had brought it 2 days ago, containing updated information about council voting patterns. "You're saying you recognize Luca's stationery?" "I'm saying I'd know it anywhere. And 3 weeks ago, the morning after your father died, I saw a folder exactly like that one in Vittorio's private study. The same distinctive embossing. She paused. It was sitting on the desk beside an empty wine glass. The pieces began assembling themselves into a pattern Augusto didn't want to see. Luca in the study when he'd claimed to be elsewhere. Wine on his cuff. His personal stationery left behind. And the security footage gap that someone with inside knowledge could have created. This doesn't prove anything, Augusto said slowly, though his mind was already cataloging every conversation he'd had with Luca since Vittorio's death, every recommendation his consigliere had made. No, Peggy agreed, but it's a contradiction. And in my experience, contradictions usually mean someone's lying. Augusto looked at her. This woman who'd spent 2 years making herself invisible, who'd noticed details everyone else had missed because her survival had depended on paying attention. Why tell me now? He asked again. You're still angry with me. I am, Peggy said quietly. But that doesn't change the fact that someone murdered your father, and if Luca was involved. She stopped. You deserve to know. The simple honesty of it made something in Augusto's chest tighten. Thank you, he said. Peggy nodded and turned toward the door. Peggy. She paused. I'm sorry, Augusto said. Not for apologizing before. I know that didn't fix anything. I'm sorry for not understanding why what I did was wrong. You were right. I tried to control the outcome instead of trusting you to reach it yourself. For the first time in 3 days, Peggy's expression softened slightly. I know, she said. And I appreciate that you understand the difference now. She left before he could say anything else. Augusto sat alone in his study and began the difficult process of investigating the man he'd trusted most, using observations from the woman he'd almost lost through his own arrogance. The estate security logs confirmed Peggy's memory. Luca had signed in at 6:47 the morning after Vittorio's death, claiming he'd driven through the night from a meeting 2 hours north. But the wine stain, the folder, the presence in a room he shouldn't have accessed, all of it suggested he'd been on the estate the night before. Augusto called his head of security personally. I need everything on Luca Ferrante's movements 3 weeks ago, and I need it done quietly. By morning, he'd have answers. By morning, he'd know if his consigliere had helped murder his father. The security investigation took 36 hours. When the results arrived, Augusto read them twice, hoping he'd misunderstood. But the evidence was clear. Luca had been on the estate the night Vittorio died. Phone records showed encrypted communications with Cesare, dating back 6 months. Financial transfers revealed payments from accounts Luca couldn't possibly afford on his salary. His consigliere, the man Augusto had trusted with operational details, family security, his own life, had been working with Cesare to destabilize him. And almost certainly, they'd killed his father. Augusto was still processing this when his head of security knocked on his study door at 11 at night. We have a problem, Marco said quietly. He never called himself Marco during working hours, which meant this was serious. Evidence has surfaced. Documents linking Mrs. Beneventi to your father's death. Augusto's blood went cold. What documents? Financial records showing payments from Moretti accounts to her father 2 months before Vittorio died. Correspondence suggesting the debt was leverage for gathering information. And, Marco hesitated. A folder containing notes about Vittorio's health routines and medication schedule. Her fingerprints are on it. That's impossible. The fingerprints are genuine. The folder was found in her room an hour ago during a routine security sweep. Augusto's mind raced. Peggy had been with her sister all afternoon. She'd returned only an hour ago and gone straight to her room. Someone had planted this. Who ordered the sweep? Augusto asked quietly. Luca. He said it was standard protocol before the council vote. Of course he did. The emergency council meeting convened at midnight in the formal conference room. Augusto sat at the head of the table with Peggy beside him, very still and very pale. Across from them, Luca presented the evidence with the same calm competence he brought to every briefing. The financial records are clear, Luca said, spreading documents across the table. Payments from Moretti accounts to Thomas Williams, Mrs. Beneventi's father, 2 months before Vittorio's death. The amounts are significant, not debt payments, but active compensation. Cesare leaned forward with an expression of calculated concern. And the folder contains detailed notes about Vittorio's daily routine, medication schedule, and security gaps. Mrs. Beneventi's fingerprints are present on multiple pages. Julia, sitting to Augusto's right, looked at Peggy with something that might have been disappointment. "Can you explain this, child?" Peggy's voice remained steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "I've never seen those documents before tonight." "The folder. I've handled hundreds of folders while organizing offices and studies. Someone could have deliberately used one I'd previously touched." "Convenient," Cesare murmured. "Or truthful," Julia said sharply. "Though I admit the timing is suspicious." Marco, Cesare's son, spoke carefully. "The council requires certainty before the vote. If there's any question about Mrs. Beneventi's loyalty, then we investigate properly," Augusto interrupted. "Not through midnight ambush based on evidence that appeared conveniently hours before the council vote." Luca's expression remained neutral. "With respect, the evidence exists regardless of timing. The council deserves answers." "I agree." Cesare's tone was reasonable, which made it more dangerous. "Which is why I propose Mrs. Beneventi be placed under house supervision while we conduct a thorough investigation. For everyone's protection, including hers. House supervision, the polite term for imprisonment." Augusto felt the room shift. 3 council members nodded. Even Julia looked troubled rather than opposed. "The alternative," Luca said quietly, meeting Augusto's gaze, "is to demonstrate impartial leadership by supporting the investigation personally. Show the council you put family interests above personal attachment." The trap was elegant. Surrender Peggy to investigation and appear strong, impartial, worthy of leading the family. Or protect his wife and appear compromised, emotional, unfit for the position his father had built. Augusto looked at Peggy. She didn't beg, didn't plead. She simply sat with the same quiet dignity she'd shown the first night she'd told him no, and waited to discover what kind of man she'd married. The choice was simple. He could have power, or he could choose her. "No," Augusto said clearly. The room went silent. "No," Cesare repeated. "Mrs. Beneventi remains under my protection. If the council requires investigation, it will be conducted transparently, with her full cooperation. But she will not be imprisoned based on evidence that appeared overnight in a manner designed to influence council proceedings." Luca's expression flickered, just for a moment, and Augusto saw calculation beneath the concern. "You realize what you're risking," Cesare said softly. "Completely. The council vote is in 2 days. This decision will influence how members view your judgment. Then they'll vote accordingly." Augusto's gaze moved around the table, meeting each council member's eyes in turn. "I won't sacrifice an innocent woman to political convenience. If that makes me unfit to lead in your assessment, so be it." 3 council members exchanged glances. Julia looked at him with something that might have been approval or concern, possibly both. Cesare leaned back in his chair. "You've made your position clear." The meeting adjourned 20 minutes later, with nothing resolved and everything changed. Augusto walked Peggy back to her room in silence. Outside her door, she finally spoke. "You just lost the vote. Possibly? You chose me over your succession." "Yes." Peggy looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" "Because somewhere between the contract and this moment, she'd stopped being a solution to a problem and become the person whose opinion of him mattered more than power. Because he'd rather lose everything than become the kind of man who sacrificed innocent people to maintain control. Because for the first time in his life, someone else's freedom felt more important than his own security." "Because you were right," Augusto said quietly. "Love isn't about controlling the direction people run in. And if I have to choose between leading the family and becoming someone you can't respect, I choose you." Peggy's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I need to tell you something," she said, "about the folder. I think I know why my fingerprints are on it." And she explained about Luca's distinctive stationery, about reorganizing his office 3 months ago, about handling dozens of his personal folders during routine cleaning. By the time she finished, Augusto understood. Luca hadn't just framed Peggy. He'd done it using materials he knew she'd touched innocently, creating evidence that would be technically accurate and completely false. "We can prove this," Augusto said. "Maybe. But will the council believe it before the vote? Probably not." But Augusto had already made his choice. "Then we find another way," he said. "Together." For the first time since the architecture disaster, Peggy smiled at him. "Together," she agreed. Augusto spent the next morning doing what he should have done weeks ago, investigating Luca Ferrante with the same ruthless thoroughness he applied to external threats. The security logs Peggy had remembered became the thread that unraveled everything. Luca had been on the estate the night Vittorio died, despite claiming otherwise. But more than that, the encrypted communications with Cesare revealed a conspiracy that had been building for over a year. Vittorio had discovered the embezzlement, Cesare and Luca systematically diverting legitimate Beneventi assets and feeding information to rival organizations. Vittorio had intended to remove them both, so they'd removed him first. The medical examiner's original report, buried beneath the official findings, noted digitalis levels inconsistent with Vittorio's prescribed medications. Someone had carefully poisoned him over several days, inducing symptoms that mimicked heart failure in a man already known to have cardiac issues. Someone with access to his private study. Someone who knew his routines, his medication schedule, his security patterns. Someone Vittorio had trusted enough not to question. By noon, Augusto had enough evidence to destroy Luca. But evidence alone wouldn't be enough. Not with the council vote scheduled for tomorrow and half the members already questioning Augusto's judgment. He needed a confession. The confrontation happened in Augusto's study, with only Peggy and Marco present as witnesses. Luca arrived expecting a strategy session about managing council concerns. Instead, he found Augusto standing behind his desk with documents spread across the surface, like accusations. "Sit down," Augusto said quietly. Luca's expression shifted, confusion, then calculation, then the careful neutrality of someone realizing they'd walked into a trap. "Augusto, sit." Luca sat. Augusto placed the first document in front of him. "Estate security logs showing you on the property the night my father died. You claimed to be 2 hours north. There must be an error." The second document. Encrypted communications with Cesare dating back 18 months, discussing asset transfers and organizational vulnerabilities. Luca's jaw tightened. The third document. The original medical examiner's notes. Digitalis poisoning disguised as heart failure. Silence. "You were the only person besides my father who had unrestricted access to his private study," Augusto continued, his voice deadly calm. "The only person who knew his medication routine well enough to alter it without detection. The only person he trusted enough not to question." "This is circumstantial," Luca said, but his voice had lost its conviction. "The wine stain on your cuff, the morning after he died. The folder with your distinctive stationery left in his study. The security footage gap that required intimate knowledge of maintenance schedules." Augusto leaned forward. "My wife remembered details you thought no one noticed because she spent 2 years being invisible. She saw what you didn't think mattered." Luca's gaze flicked to Peggy, and for the first time, genuine emotion crossed his face. Anger. "The maid," he said. "You're destroying everything over a woman you married for convenience." "No, I'm destroying you for murdering my father." Augusto's voice could have cut glass. "The marriage was convenient. She isn't." "Vittorio was dying anyway," Luca said, abandoning pretense. "His heart was failing. We simply accelerated the inevitable." There it was. Not quite a full confession, but enough. Why? Augusto asked. Because he was going to dismantle everything Cesare and I had built. Years of careful planning, strategic positioning, assets we'd cultivated. Vittorio discovered the transfers and decided we were liabilities. Luca's composure cracked slightly. He was going to remove us, publicly. Destroy our reputations and our lives over money that wouldn't have mattered to the family's bottom line. So you killed him. We protected ourselves. And we would have succeeded if you'd simply married the woman we'd positioned for you, failed the succession requirements, or become destabilized enough for the council to remove you naturally. Luca's expression hardened. But you married the maid. The invisible woman nobody was supposed to notice, and she remembered things she had no business remembering. She remembered, Augusto agreed, because she pays attention, because she's intelligent, observant, and loyal in ways you never were. Loyal? Luca laughed bitterly. You chose her over your succession, over your family, over everything your father built. That's not loyalty. That's weakness. No, Peggy said quietly, speaking for the first time. It's knowing the difference between love and control. Luca looked at her with contempt. And what does a maid know about either? More than you, apparently. Peggy's voice remained steady. I know that real loyalty doesn't murder the person you claim to serve, and love doesn't manipulate people into cages and call it protection. The words hit Augusto harder than they hit Luca. He understood she wasn't just talking about the consigliere's betrayal. She was talking about the architecture program, about every time Augusto had tried to solve problems by controlling outcomes rather than trusting people to make their own choices. Marco, silent until now, stood. I'll secure him until the council meeting. Wait, Augusto looked at Luca. This man he'd trusted, confided in, treated almost like a brother. Did you ever believe in any of it? The family, the organization, what we were trying to build? Luca met his gaze without flinching. I believed in survival. Everything else was just strategy. Then we have nothing more to discuss. Marco escorted Luca from the study. Through the window, Augusto watched them cross the courtyard toward the security building where his former consigliere would be held until the council convened. Peggy remained seated, her hands folded in her lap. You have your evidence now, she said quietly. The council will have to believe you. Perhaps. Augusto moved to sit in the chair Luca had vacated. Though I suspect Cesare will argue I manufactured everything to protect you. Will they vote against you? Some will. Maybe enough to matter. He looked at her. I meant what I said last night. I don't regret choosing you. Peggy's expression softened. Even if it costs you everything? Especially then. They sat in silence for a moment, and Augusto realized that regardless of what happened tomorrow, whether the council confirmed his succession or fractured the organization, he'd already won the only thing that mattered. He'd chosen correctly. Not strategically, not politically, correctly. What happens now? Peggy asked. Now we prepare to convince the council that the man they trusted was a murderer, and the woman they suspect is innocent. Augusto managed a slight smile. Though given recent events, I'm beginning to think you're better at convincing people than I am. Then let me help, Peggy said. Actually help. Not as the invisible maid or the convenient wife, as your partner. Augusto looked at her and understood what she was offering. Not just cooperation, but genuine collaboration. The thing he'd been too controlling to accept before. I would appreciate that, he said quietly. Peggy stood and moved toward the documents still spread across his desk. Then let's build a case even Cesare can't dispute. Together, they began preparing for the fight that would determine not just Augusto's succession, but whether the family he'd inherited was worth leading at all. The council meeting lasted 4 hours. Augusto presented evidence methodically. Security logs, communications records, the medical examiner's original findings, and finally, Luca's own words, recorded during yesterday's confrontation. Peggy testified about what she'd seen the night Vittorio died, about the wine stain and the distinctive stationery, about 2 years of quiet observation that had noticed what everyone else missed. Cesare fought back with everything he had, arguing conspiracy, fabrication, desperate attempts to protect a compromised marriage. But the evidence was overwhelming, and when Marco, Cesare's own son, corroborated Peggy's testimony and added that he'd been approached by his father to support the conspiracy, the council's resolve fractured. By evening, the vote was decided. Augusto's succession was confirmed. Luca was remanded to face justice through channels Augusto preferred not to explain to Peggy. And Cesare was removed from all family business, his assets frozen, his influence destroyed. Augusto had won. He'd secured his position, exposed his father's murderers, and demonstrated the kind of leadership the council respected, ruthless when necessary, but never at the expense of innocent people. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt hollow. He found Peggy in the library 3 days later, sitting in the window seat where afternoon light fell across the pages of a book she wasn't reading. "The council wants to meet you formally next week," Augusto said from the doorway. "A reception to introduce the family's new leadership structure." Peggy looked up. Of course. Her voice was polite, appropriate, completely empty. Augusto crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite her. "The 3 months are almost over. 5 more weeks, technically." Technically. He paused. "Though the succession is secured now, the contract's purpose has been fulfilled." "Yes," Peggy agreed quietly. "It has." Silence stretched between them. Not the comfortable quiet of shared space, but the awkward distance of two people avoiding what needed to be said. "I've been thinking," Peggy continued, setting her book aside, "about what happens next. You'll need to transition carefully. Make it clear the separation is amicable, that I'm leaving with compensation and goodwill. That way the council can't claim instability." She'd been planning this, preparing for the ending they'd agreed to from the beginning. "And you?" Augusto asked. "What will you do?" "I have the settlement money. I can enroll in architecture school. A different one, somewhere away from here. Start over without—" She stopped. "Without complications. Without him," she meant. Augusto should agree, should thank her for her service, arrange the separation, and let her walk away to build the life she'd sacrificed years ago. Instead, he said, "I don't want you to go." Peggy's hands stilled on the book. "Augusto, I know what the contract says. I know we agreed to 3 months. But somewhere between the negotiation and now, this stopped being a transaction." He leaned forward. "I don't want a separation. I want—" He stopped, searching for words that had always come easily in business negotiations but felt impossible now. I want you to stay." "As what?" Peggy's voice was barely audible. "Your wife? Your partner? The woman who reminds you not to control outcomes?" "Yes, all of it." Augusto pulled a folder from his jacket and set it on the table between them. "But not because a contract requires it." Peggy opened the folder slowly. Inside were legal documents, dissolution papers, formally terminating their marriage agreement. Beside them, burned fragments of what had once been their handwritten contract, carefully preserved in a protective sleeve. "I don't understand," she said. "The first time I asked you to be my wife, I needed something from you. A solution to a political problem." Augusto's voice was steady, despite the fear clawing at his chest. "I needed you to be convenient." Peggy looked at him. "And now? Now I need you to be free enough to tell me no. To walk away if this isn't what you want. To choose." He stopped. "Not what's safe or strategic or beneficial, just what you actually want." Peggy stared at the dissolution papers, at the burned contract, at the man who'd spent his life controlling outcomes, offering her complete freedom. "You're letting me go," she said quietly. "I'm asking you to choose. And if I choose to leave?" The question felt like a knife between his ribs. "Then I'll help you enroll wherever you want to study. I'll make sure you're protected and provided for. And I'll learn to live with the fact that I met the right person at the wrong time, in the wrong way." Tears gathered in Peggy's eyes. You really mean that? Yes. You just let me walk away, if that's what you choose. Augusto managed a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Though I should mention that if you stay, I'll spend the rest of my life learning to ask instead of deciding. I'll make mistakes. Controlling outcomes is instinctive for me. But I'll try. Every day, I'll try to be the kind of man who deserves the choice you're making. Peggy picked up the dissolution papers, and Augusto's heart stopped. Then she set them aside without signing. One condition, she said. Despite everything, Augusto almost laughed. Of course there was a condition. What? Architecture school. My decision, my application, my achievement. Yours completely. My career, my choices about what projects I take and what I refuse. I wouldn't want it any other way. And when you forget, because you will forget, Augusto, controlling things is who you are. I get to remind you without you taking it as betrayal. I welcome the reminder. Peggy studied him with the same careful attention she'd given everything since the moment she'd told him no in his study. You understand this won't be easy? That I'm going to challenge you constantly? That I'll never be the kind of wife who simply agrees with everything you decide? I'm counting on it. And you're certain? Because I won't do this halfway. If I stay as your equal, as your partner, not as the maid who got lucky or the woman you needed for politics. I don't want the maid, Augusto said quietly. I don't want the political solution. I want Peggy Williams, who told the most feared man in the city no and meant it. Who remembers details everyone else misses? Who designs buildings where people can feel safe and believes love means giving people choices instead of cages? I want you exactly as you are. Peggy's tears spilled over. That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me. I've been practicing. She laughed through her tears, and the sound filled spaces in Augusto's chest he hadn't known were empty. Then yes, Peggy said. I choose you. I choose this. All of it. Augusto stood and offered his hand. May I? Peggy looked at his outstretched hand. The same question he'd asked a dozen times. First out of contractual obligation, then out of growing habit, and now out of genuine respect for her autonomy. She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. You may, she said. And when he kissed her, it tasted like choice, and second chances, and promises neither of them had expected to keep. 6 months later, Peggy sat at the long table in Augusto's study, with architectural plans spread across half the surface, a cold cup of coffee at her elbow, and pencil smudges on her hands. The design was for a community center in the South District, the same neighborhood where Marco had nearly purchased the building with foundation issues. Instead of that disaster, the Beneventi Foundation had acquired adjacent properties and hired Peggy to create something that actually served the people who lived there. Not as a favor, as a job. She'd submitted a proposal through the foundation's standard application process, competed against 3 other firms, and won the contract based on her design's merit. Augusto had recused himself from the selection committee entirely, and Peggy had the documentation to prove it. It had taken her 4 months to stop questioning whether she'd truly earned it. Now she was simply focused on getting the details right. The center would have multiple entrances, important in a neighborhood where people needed options for coming and going safely. Wide windows for natural light, a central courtyard visible from multiple angles, reading rooms, meeting spaces, a commercial kitchen for community meals, and offices for social services. Spaces where people could breathe. You're still working. Peggy looked up to find Augusto in the doorway, tie loosened and jacket abandoned somewhere between his meetings and here. The contractor needs final approvals by Friday, she said, gesturing at the plans. I'm trying to solve the northwest corner without compromising the sightlines. Augusto crossed to the table and studied her drawings with the same focused attention he gave everything that mattered to her. He'd learned architecture terminology over the past months, not to interfere with her work, but to understand what she was creating. What if you extended the roofline here? He suggested, pointing to a section. It would maintain the visual access while creating covered entry. Peggy tilted her head, considering. He was right. She sketched the modification quickly, and the corner problem solved itself. "That works," she said. "Thank you." "You would have found it eventually." "Probably, but this is faster." She smiled up at him. "See? Collaboration. I'm learning." He was. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. Augusto still struggled with his instinct to solve problems by controlling outcomes, but now he caught himself. Asked instead of decided. Offered help instead of implementing solutions without permission. Last month, when Peggy had mentioned struggling with a structural engineering requirement, Augusto had started to reach for his phone to call in a favor. Then he'd stopped, looked at her, and asked, "Would you like me to recommend someone, or would you prefer to find your own consultant?" It was a small thing. It meant everything. "How were your meetings?" Peggy asked, setting down her pencil. "Productive. We finalized the agreement with the northern families." Augusto moved to pour himself coffee from the service Peggy had brought up hours ago. "Marco sends his regards. He's convinced you should design his new offices." "Is he trying to bribe me for family discounts?" "Almost certainly." Peggy laughed. Marco had become an unexpected ally over the past months. Supportive of her work, protective of her position in the family, and genuinely apologetic about his father's conspiracy. He'd testified against Cesare without hesitation, choosing integrity over family loyalty in a way that had earned Augusto's permanent respect. The doorway darkened, and Julia appeared with the kind of expression that meant she had opinions. "You're both still working at 8 in the evening," she announced. "This is why young people develop stomach problems." "We're finishing," Peggy assured her. "Good. Because I've arranged dinner, and I refuse to eat alone while you two lurk in studies, pretending productivity is more important than food." Julia's sharp gaze landed on Augusto. "Your father did the same thing. Worked himself into an early grave." The comment would have devastated Augusto 6 months ago. Now he simply nodded. "Point taken. We'll be down in 10 minutes. 5. Julia corrected, and disappeared as quickly as she'd arrived. Peggy began gathering her plans. Augusto moved to help, and their hands brushed over the same drawing. He pulled back automatically, and Peggy caught his wrist. "You don't have to ask permission every time," she said gently. "We're married. Actually married now." They'd had a second ceremony 2 months ago. Small, genuine, attended by people they actually cared about, rather than political necessities. Peggy had worn a simple dress she'd chosen herself, and Augusto had written vows that made her cry. She'd written hers, too. "I promise to tell you when you're being controlling. I promise to let you help when I actually need it. I promise to build spaces where people feel safe, including you." "I know," Augusto said, "but I like asking. It reminds me that nothing about you is owed or required. That everything you give me is choice." Peggy's throat tightened. 6 months, and he could still surprise her with understanding that had taken him years to develop. She reached up and straightened his tie, a gesture that had become instinctive over the months, intimate in its domesticity. "I choose you," she said quietly. "Every day, I choose you." Augusto's hand came up to cover hers. "Even when I'm controlling?" "Even then. Though I reserve the right to call you on it. I'm counting on it." They stood there for a moment, his hand over hers, her palm against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat, steady, real, hers. "We should go before Julia comes back," Peggy said. "Agreed, though first." Augusto caught her hand as she started to pull away. "May I?" Peggy looked up at him, at this man who'd learned to ask instead of command, who'd chosen her over power, who'd burned their contract and offered her freedom instead of control. "You may," she said. He kissed her softly, unhurried, the kind of kiss that didn't need to lead anywhere because they had time. They had choice. They had each other. When they pulled apart, Peggy gathered her plans while Augusto collected coffee cups, and together they headed downstairs to dinner, with family that had become real rather than political. Later that night, after Julia had finally released them and they'd retreated upstairs, Peggy found Augusto standing at the window of his study, looking out over the grounds he'd inherited and nearly lost. "You're thinking about your father," she said from the doorway. "How did you know?" "You get quiet. A specific kind of quiet." She crossed to stand beside him. "Do you miss him?" "Sometimes. Then I remember what he taught me about love being weakness, and I'm glad he's not here to see me prove him wrong." Peggy slipped her hand into his. "You haven't proved him wrong." Augusto looked at her, surprised. "You've proved yourself right," she continued. "There's a difference. His beliefs were his. Yours are yours." It was such a Peggy observation, precise, compassionate, refusing to let him define himself in opposition to Vittorio instead of in support of his own values. "Thank you," Augusto said quietly. They stood together at the window, watching lights from the city spread out below, and Peggy thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, the maid who'd made herself invisible, who'd believed safety meant never being noticed. That woman had been surviving. This woman, standing beside the man who'd learned to ask instead of command, building spaces where people could feel safe, choosing freely, every single day, was living. "I enrolled in structural engineering for next semester," Peggy said. "The community center design made me realize how much I don't know about load-bearing requirements." "That's ambitious. Is that your way of saying it's too much?" "No. It's my way of asking if you need anything to make it work." Peggy smiled. He'd learned the difference between offering support and taking control. "Just time to study, and patience when I'm stressed about midterms. Both readily available." She leaned against him, and his arm came around her shoulders automatically. No asking required for this. The casual intimacy of two people who'd chosen each other and kept choosing every day. "Peggy?" "Thank you for saying no that first night, for forcing me to explain instead of just obeying." "You're welcome, though I should mention, I'm going to keep saying no when you're being unreasonable. I'm counting on it." Below them, the city continued its complicated existence, dangerous and beautiful, controlled and chaotic, exactly like the life they'd built together. Peggy thought about the buildings she was designing, the degree she was earning, the family she'd unexpectedly joined. About the man beside her who'd offered her freedom instead of security and somehow given her both. At the beginning, Augusto had needed a wife. Now he had a partner. At the beginning, Peggy had needed safety. Now she had choice. And every morning when she woke in the room that locked from her side, the lock she never used anymore but appreciated having, she chose him. Every evening, when Augusto came home from meetings that still carried danger, she preferred not to examine too closely. He asked instead of assumed. It wasn't the fairy tale people imagined when they thought about marrying powerful men. It was better. It was real. In the study where she'd once delivered coffee and made herself invisible, Peggy's architectural plans now covered half the desk. A home, not a fortress. Exactly what she'd been designing all along. If you enjoyed Peggy's and Augusto's story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Also comment where you are watching from, and I'll see you in the next one.